Detective John O'Reilly had seen his share of baffling cases over 2 decades on the force. Yet when he first stepped into the warm, lamp-lit hallway of the suburban condominium on a cold night in 1989, something told him this was no ordinary homicide. He was new to the Westchester County Police Department's Major Crimes Division, having spent years dealing with robberies and domestic disputes in a less affluent district. Now he found himself in one of New York's most tranquil suburbs, where the streets were neatly lined with parked cars and manicured lawns. Someone had been shot in her own home. The call had come in as a possible homicide, and from the moment he arrived, he could sense a ripple effect that would soon rattle the entire county. The neighbors huddled under porch lights, anxious and silent, as patrol officers moved in to secure the perimeter. Inside the condominium, paramedics had already determined that the victim was beyond help. It was a chilling sight for an area known mostly for quiet nights and neighborly gatherings. The victim, Jeanne Solomon, was found in her living room, a single lamp casting harsh shadows on the walls, bullet casings glinting under the light. The fact that she had been killed with such calculated brutality in a suburban home suggested something personal. Random violence rarely ended so decisively. Before any of the forensic technicians arrived, O'Reilly paced through the scene, maintaining a respectable distance while absorbing details. Shell casings, footprints, the faint smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. These fragments of a story all felt tangled in a web of personal animosity. A murder in Westchester often hit the media quickly, but this one felt bigger. Perhaps it was the victim's family status or the immediate rumors floating among the whispered crowd outside. Something about jealousy, an affair, a secret that no one dared mention above a hushed tone. O'Reilly knew it was just the beginning of a deep, complicated investigation, a case that would soon gain infamy as it revealed a twisted account of obsession, betrayal, and murder. It would test the limits of forensic science at the time and spark a media frenzy that lingered in the hearts and minds of the community for years to come. Jeanne Solomon was the name the officers jotted down in their notebooks. Carolyn Warmus would become the name investigators could not forget. The story that wove these women together would rattle a quiet, scenic pocket of New York and feed the headlines for nearly a decade. And Detective O'Reilly, like the rest of the investigative team, would find himself caught in the crosscurrents of a puzzle that stretched beyond the usual bounds of suburban crime. He took a final look at the still form on the living room floor and promised himself he would see this through, no matter how deep the investigation had to go. That night he had no way of knowing how tangled the threads would become, or that the final resolution would make headlines from coast to coast. Yet he sensed the weight of what lay before him. In a few hours, forensics teams would swarm the place, and the name of Carolyn Warmus would start creeping into hushed conversations. The case's impact would be undeniable. The real challenge was only beginning. Paul Solomon's wife was dead, and soon Carolyn Warmus, a fellow teacher at an elementary school, would find herself at the center of a media storm. The quiet suburban murder would evolve into a legal drama that tested the boundaries of evidence interpretation and forced investigators to navigate a labyrinth of phone records, bullet trajectories, and hidden motives. In the background, the press would paint vivid pictures of a lethal obsession, fueling public outcry and speculation. Even now, decades later, the memory of this case stands as a chilling example of how jealousy can spiral into tragedy. It began on that cold evening in 1989 when a detective with a keen eye for detail first surveyed the living room and realized the suburb's polished veneer concealed a very dark secret. Jeanne Solomon's friends described her as outgoing, generous, and open-hearted, with an eagerness to help those in need. She was born in 1947 and raised in a modest household on the outskirts of Manhattan. From an early age, she displayed a caring spirit. Her parents noticed how she would share toys with children who had none, and her teachers often praised her empathetic nature. She grew into a compassionate teenager, participating in community food drives and church bake sales, forging friendships that would endure into her adulthood. In high school, Betty Jeanne was known as a diligent student who balanced social activities with strong academic performance. Her family was proud of her drive, though finances were tight. She often took on part-time jobs, babysitting or helping out at a local grocery store, to support her ambitions. During those adolescent years, Betty Jeanne discovered an inclination for helping children with reading and math, and she imagined a future where she could merge her caring personality with a career that served others. After graduation, she enrolled at a local college, majoring in education. It was there that her love for kids blossomed further, as she volunteered with literacy programs in underprivileged neighborhoods. She met Paul Solomon during her sophomore year at a college mixer. He was an easygoing presence, humorous and warm. They bonded quickly over a mutual respect for family values. Betty Jeanne found in Paul a certain steadiness and optimism that balanced her own empathetic nature. They dated for nearly 2 years, sharing talk of life goals and the possibility of a quiet suburban future. When they finally married, they both had modest teaching positions lined up. Betty Jeanne in particular thrived in the classroom, known among faculty for her dedication. She believed that investing in children's education was the path to better communities, a sentiment that resonated with Paul as well. Betty Jeanne's parents saw their daughter settling into a fulfilling life with the man she loved. The couple rented a cozy apartment before eventually buying a condominium in Westchester County. She decorated it with small touches that reflected her warm personality. Family photos arranged just so. Family laws arranged just so. Family photos arranged just so. Never relatives visited, they marveled at the tranquility of the place. Outside of work, Betty Jeanne joined local charities, continuing her passion for community service. Her circle of friends expanded. Children adored her kindness, and their parents admired her willingness to go the extra mile in the classroom. She was in her early 40s by the time of her murder, well respected in her community, stable in her career, and, at least outwardly, content in her marriage. She had a solid network of social connections, built up from years of unwavering kindness. Many in her circle were other teachers or neighbors from the condominium complex. She often hosted potluck dinners, where laughter and conversation flowed freely. She was not someone who carried secrets easily. When troubles arose, she tended to confide in close friends, seeking their counsel. As far as anyone knew, there was no tension in her marriage worth raising alarm bells. She and Paul appeared like any ordinary suburban couple, sharing finances, taking occasional weekend trips, and managing the everyday ups and downs of married life. Within the school environment, Betty Jeanne was well liked. She worked with special needs students in reading programs, often staying after hours to provide extra help. Her husband, Paul, also a teacher, taught in another school, but they sometimes crossed paths at district-wide gatherings. The two had a shared circle of acquaintances who often commented on what a lovely couple they made. Betty Jeanne had a few close confidants who noticed she sometimes seemed stressed, particularly in the months leading up to her death. Yet she never elaborated much on the source of her worry. Friends simply assumed it was part of the normal strain of working in education or mild marital tensions that couples occasionally face. Few suspected anything sinister lurking in the background. In the days leading up to the murder, Betty Jeanne kept to her usual routine. She woke early, prepared lesson plans, and commuted to school. She occasionally called home during breaks to check on errands or chat about dinner arrangements. Friends recall her being in decent spirits, though she had reportedly confided some discontent regarding Paul. Still, it was nothing that set off alarms. On the weekend before her death, she spent time with a neighbor, helping organize a small fundraiser. Later that evening, she prepared a homemade meal for Paul, though he seemed preoccupied. Betty Jeanne's final day followed a familiar pattern, teaching her morning classes, grading quizzes during lunch, and chatting with a colleague about upcoming school events. That evening, she was supposed to meet a friend for a quick dinner. But plans shifted, and she ended up at home alone. No one knows her exact final thoughts. Investigators speculate she was reading in the living room when someone knocked on the door. It remains unclear whether she recognized the visitor or sensed danger the moment she opened it. The crime scene suggested minimal struggle, leading authorities to believe she was taken by surprise. There were no immediate signs of forced entry, implying that the assailant might have been someone she knew or trusted. The bullet casings found near her body suggested multiple shots, a deliberate and personal attack. In the brief window of her final moments, Betty Jean's phone lay off to one side, hinting she might have tried to call for help. Her state of mind, as best her friends could describe in retrospect, was a mixture of mild concern about her marriage and a general weariness, yet also her typical resilience and hopeful outlook toward the future. She was by all outward appearances a caring educator, a loving wife, and a woman not prone to confronting danger. The abruptness and violence of her death left her community reeling. Carolyn Warmus was born in 1964 into a life that would have seemed privileged to outside observers. She was raised primarily in the Detroit area, the daughter of a wealthy insurance executive. Carolyn's mother divorced her father while Carolyn was still young, and the split influenced her upbringing significantly. Though her father had ample resources, the family dynamic proved complicated. Carolyn spent much of her childhood living in upscale neighborhoods, where private schools and lavish vacations were common. She was described by peers as bright and sociable, if somewhat reserved. Yet behind the comfortable facade, Carolyn appeared to crave attention and approval. She maintained decent grades, participating in extracurricular activities that often highlighted her social abilities, cheerleading, debate, and charity clubs. By her teenage years, Carolyn's parents noted that she had a tendency to become intensely focused on relationships, sometimes reacting dramatically to perceived slights. She desired close bonds, but seemed to lack the patience or emotional resilience to navigate typical adolescent conflicts. After high school, she enrolled at the University of Michigan, briefly studying psychology before transferring to a different program. Accounts differ as to why she hopped majors and eventually left school earlier than planned. Some blame a tumultuous romantic involvement, others mention a lack of academic focus. Whatever the reason, Carolyn drifted for a time, testing the waters in the workforce. A short stint as a teacher's assistant ignited her interest in education, and she decided to move to New York, possibly envisioning the excitement and prestige that might come with living near the city. Once in New York, Carolyn secured a position teaching elementary school. She projected confidence and friendliness, easily forming connections with fellow educators. Her background allowed her certain luxuries. She drove nice cars, wore stylish outfits, and took extravagant vacations. Colleagues noticed she rarely appeared anxious about finances, an unusual trait for a young teacher. At the same time, some found her overly flirtatious, even manipulative in certain social situations. Carolyn seemed to relish attention, especially from men, though most dismissed it as harmless charm. Those who knew her best suspected that her persona masked deeper insecurities and that she often sought validation through romantic pursuits. Psychologically, Carolyn displayed an overarching need for acceptance and admiration. She spoke fondly of her father's wealth, though she rarely admitted feeling overshadowed by his success. She'd had a few serious relationships over the years, each ending on sour terms that left her feeling betrayed or misunderstood. She held on to grudges, according to at least one ex-boyfriend, who claimed that she could be relentless when she felt wronged. Various acquaintances described her as sweet on the surface, yet prone to sudden mood swings if she believed she was losing control of a situation. This intensity laid the foundation for what some experts would later characterize as an obsessive personality. In group settings, Carolyn was witty and energetic, often the life of the party, but privately she struggled with self-doubt and a longing for a grand romance that mirrored the ones in her beloved novels and films. By the time she began teaching at the same school as Paul Solomon, Carolyn had established herself as a dedicated, if sometimes overly enthusiastic educator. She took a particular shine to certain students, showering them with praise and small gifts. She also joined staff committees, coordinating events and after-school programs. Colleagues labeled her as extremely sociable, even though a few found her brand of friendliness too personal, bordering on invasive. Carolyn did not shy away from flirtation, and rumors occasionally circulated that she preferred the company of married men. Whether these were mere gossip or grounded in truth remained unclear until her relationship with Paul Solomon came to light. Socially, Carolyn gravitated toward more affluent circles, frequenting upscale restaurants and clubs. If she liked someone, she poured attention on them, sometimes overwhelming them with phone calls, invitations, and unannounced visits. She yearned for close companionship, yet seemed to sabotage those relationships by demanding absolute attention and loyalty. Underneath the glamorous surface was a woman harboring jealousy and insecurity, traits that would dangerously manifest when faced with the perceived threat of rejection. Over the course of her involvement with Paul, her behavior grew increasingly erratic. She believed they shared a grand passion, and that she could ultimately replace his wife in his affections. This delusion only deepened when she realized Paul was conflicted about leaving Betty Jeanne. If Carolyn Warmus's background set the stage for emotional volatility, her budding affair with Paul Solomon was the catalyst that propelled her toward criminal action. Investigators, and later court-appointed psychologists, debated whether she would have resorted to violence without the triggers she encountered. The consensus was that Carolyn's obsessive streak, combined with her inflated sense of entitlement, made her ill-prepared for unrequited love. Once she had tasted the thrill of a forbidden romance, she became enthralled by the idea of winning Paul entirely. She began seeking ways to eliminate perceived obstacles. That eventually led her to the doorstep of Jeanne Solomon, forging a path that ended in murder. The steps Carolyn took, purchasing a weapon, carefully orchestrating phone calls, revealed a calculated approach that contradicted her image as a charming, carefree teacher. Her criminal evolution was a crescendo of jealousy, desperation, and cold-blooded resolve. Though many still debate the nuances of her guilt, few deny that her obsession became lethal the night Betty Jeanne lost her life. In the months leading up to Jeanne Solomon's murder, an undercurrent of tension began to shape the relationships among Betty Jeanne, Paul Solomon, and Carolyn Warmus. By most accounts, Paul was an affable man who enjoyed the admiration of others, but was not necessarily seeking an affair. Colleagues, however, noted that he had a friendly rapport with Carolyn, who was younger and more openly flirtatious. Their connection started innocently enough. Shared lunch breaks, discussions about lesson plans, perhaps a few offhand compliments that might have been misconstrued. The boundary between casual friendship and flirtation blurred around the time Carolyn invited Paul to join a small group of co-workers at a local bar. One evening drink turned into a more private rendezvous, and from there, the relationship escalated. Paul was not straightforward about his developing attachment to Carolyn, but he confided in a friend that he felt invigorated by her youth and attention. Meanwhile, Betty Jeanne sensed some strain in her marriage, though she did not have proof of an affair. She carried on, trusting Paul's explanations of working late or meeting colleagues for professional reasons. The environment at their condominium complex was typically calm. Neighbors rarely pried into each other's personal lives, so any argument or tension within the Solomon household remained largely private. Betty Jeanne's friends recalled subtle changes in her demeanor. She seemed more preoccupied, sometimes uneasy, as if she suspected that something was amiss. The build-up to the tragic night likely involved a series of hush-hush phone calls and encounters between Paul and Carolyn. Phone records would later become a focal point in the investigation, showing numerous late-night calls placed from Carolyn's phone to Paul's residence, sometimes lasting well over an hour. Carolyn began expressing impatience with Paul's unwillingness to leave his wife. On multiple occasions, she hinted at a future life together, going so far as to scout potential living arrangements. Paul, by contrast, appeared conflicted, possibly tempted by Carolyn's devotion, but reluctant to forsake Betty Jeanne entirely. This emotional tug-of-war defined the weeks leading up to the murder. In the days immediately before Betty Jeanne's death, tensions mounted. Carolyn was reportedly spotted near the Solomon residence on more than one occasion, though it remains uncertain whether Betty Jeanne saw her. Carolyn also made purchases that drew suspicion, such as buying a pair of black gloves and, according to later court records, seeking a firearm with the help of an acquaintance. These events, unremarkable at the time to anyone outside the situation, formed a pattern of premeditation. Paul, for his part, claimed he spent most of his time at school or running errands. Yet some neighbors later reported seeing his car parked in unusual spots or noticing strange comings and goings. They dismissed these observations as random occurrences, never imagining the catastrophic outcome that was about to occur. The relationship between Carolyn and Paul became the trigger that set off a deadly series of events, culminating on the evening of January 15, 1989. That night, Betty Jeanne was alone in the condominium. Paul, by his own account, claimed to be out, possibly at a local bowling alley or running some errands. His statements varied over time. The true trigger event might have been an ultimatum Carolyn delivered to Paul, or simply the festering anger she felt at her inability to secure his undivided affection. Regardless, the confluence of jealousy, premeditation, and opportunity led Carolyn to the Solomon home. The crime scene offered grim clarity about Betty Jeanne's final moments. She was found in the living room, her body riddled with 9 gunshot wounds. Yet the physical space bore subtle contradictions. There was no sign of forced entry, no immediate evidence of a break-in or struggle. Investigators noted that a lamp was knocked over, indicating a sudden scuffle or an attempt to avoid gunfire. Blood spatter analysis revealed that Betty Jeanne likely tried to flee once the shooting began, collapsing near a chair after sustaining multiple injuries. The living room, adorned with the usual decorations of a comfortable suburban home, family photos, a bookshelf, a small TV, became the canvas for a violent confrontation that stunned those who arrived on the scene. Detectives found several spent shell casings which were later matched to a .25 caliber handgun. The closeness of some of the wounds suggested a personal, possibly enraged shooter. Forensic experts concluded that the shots were fired from a relatively short distance, indicating that Betty Jeanne might have recognized her attacker just moments before being struck. One bullet lodged into a wall near the front door, indicating that at least one shot was fired as Betty Jeanne attempted to move away. The angles of entry told a story of fear and pursuit. Betty Jeanne apparently scrambled for safety, but the assailant continued firing until she collapsed. Method analysis revealed that the killer either had prior experience with firearms or had practiced sufficiently to maintain control during a high-stress confrontation. Though .25 caliber handguns are not typically associated with high-powered stopping force, the multiple shots testified to a determined effort to ensure Betty Jeanne would not survive. Investigators later suspected that Carolyn had purchased or otherwise acquired the weapon through covert means. Correcting the table, though it was a relatively small gun, it was easy to conceal and thus suited the assailant's desire for stealth. The immediate aftermath of the crime was one of shock and confusion. Neighbors heard loud noises. Some thought they were fireworks or a car backfiring, but no one rushed to check. It wasn't until a concerned friend tried calling Betty Jeanne and received no answer that someone decided to investigate. Paul Solomon arrived at the scene some time later, feigning surprise and horror. He claimed he had just learned of the incident. The paramedics who arrived first found Betty Jeanne's body beyond help. The police quickly cordoned off the area, searching for any clues to the shooter's identity. Journalists gathered in the neighborhood, drawn by the unusual nature of a homicide in such a serene location. Rumors spread about whether Paul was involved, or if a mysterious lover could be to blame. For Carolyn Warmus, the hours after the crime were spent crafting alibis and trying to appear unaffected. Phone records would ultimately show suspiciously timed calls, including one placed from a local payphone to the Solomon residence. She also made it a point to show up for work as though nothing had happened, feigning concern for Paul's tragic loss, but never betraying any knowledge of the specifics. Some acquaintances recalled her acting more subdued than usual, but no one suspected that she was harboring a deadly secret. By the time Betty Jeanne's body was discovered, Carolyn had already begun covering her tracks, inadvertently leaving behind a trail of evidence that investigators would slowly unravel. In the ensuing days, Carolyn kept an unnervingly normal routine. She continued teaching, made small talk in the teacher's lounge, and, by some accounts, even offered condolences to Paul. Yet her actions betrayed an underlying tension. She made frequent phone calls to Paul, insisting on meeting him privately. She also tried to retrieve the weapon from the acquaintance who had helped her obtain it, evidently hoping to conceal it further or destroy it. Meanwhile, the forensics team began piecing together ballistic evidence and scouring phone records, suspecting that the killer knew Betty Jeanne well enough to gain access without forced entry. Those who had observed Carolyn's behavior around Paul began dropping quiet hints to the detectives that their colleague was not all that she seemed. Within the first 48 hours, Westchester County authorities launched a full-scale investigation, spearheaded by detectives who had experience in homicide, but rarely encountered a case that drew so much rapid media attention. Neighborhood canvassing began immediately. Officers asked locals if they had noticed anything unusual on the night Betty Jeanne was killed. Most recalled hearing popping noises, but dismissed them as everyday sounds. A few mentioned seeing a woman wearing a dark coat near the condominium complex, but no one could say for certain who it was. Detective O'Reilly felt an early intuition that the crime was tied to personal motives. He interviewed Paul Solomon that first day, finding him distraught and seemingly cooperative. However, during questioning, Paul's account of his whereabouts shifted slightly. He initially claimed to have been out bowling alone. Later, he stated he visited a friend's place but could not recall the exact address. These inconsistencies, while not definitive proof of guilt, made O'Reilly cautious. The early investigation included a search of Betty Jeanne's personal records, diaries, and any correspondence that might shed light on her relationships. Detectives found no diaries but did note a set of bills and phone logs. They discovered that certain calls placed to Paul Solomon's school coincided with times Carolyn Warmus was off work. This led investigators to suspect a deeper connection between Carolyn and Paul, one that might have caused tension in the marriage. As the week wore on, Betty Jeanne's funeral took place. Paul Solomon appeared devastated, and Carolyn Warmus attended, ostensibly to pay her respects, though some attendees whispered about the uncomfortable tension between them. Behind the scenes, law enforcement began examining phone records in more detail, focusing on calls placed to and from Paul's home during the critical hours. Friends and neighbors were interviewed multiple times. Detectives learned that Carolyn was unusually close to Paul, despite his married status. Paul, under growing pressure, admitted to an affair but insisted that he had no knowledge of Carolyn's involvement in Betty Jeanne's death. Meanwhile, forensic specialists and ballistics examined the shell casings retrieved from the crime scene. They concluded that the murder weapon was likely a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol. They also took note of a distinctive pattern on the shell casings that pointed to a particular type of firearm, which was not widely distributed. This detail would later tie the weapon to a purchase Carolyn allegedly made using an intermediary. The forensic analysis included a comprehensive examination of the blood spatter. The pattern indicated that the shooter stood within a few feet of Betty Jeanne during most of the shots, underscoring a personal nature to the homicide. Specialists also analyzed carpet fibers and footprints. One partial footprint suggested a shoe size that could match Carolyn Warmus's footwear. Experts said the footprint suggested a shoe size that could match Carolyn Warmus's footwear. There was also a piece of latex glove found under a table which might have come from the killer's attempts to avoid leaving fingerprints. Carolyn's acquaintances would later remark that she purchased latex gloves around that time, though she claimed it was for household cleaning. Evidence processing took longer than detectives preferred, as each finding required careful documentation to ensure it would hold up in court. Phone records, however, emerged as one of the most critical aspects of the investigation. Detectives discovered multiple calls from Carolyn to Paul around the time of the murder, along with calls made to a New Jersey gun shop. Those records suggested that Carolyn might have tried to purchase or inquire about a specific type of firearm. Other calls to travel agencies cropped up, fueling speculation that Carolyn had planned a romantic getaway, presumably envisioning a life with Paul once Betty Jeanne was out of the picture. Investigators needed to correlate these calls with the timeline of Betty Jeanne's final hours. Detectives also sought to analyze personal letters or notes. Carolyn was known to send Paul sentimental messages. A few had been found by Paul's relatives. One letter read like an impassioned plea for him to leave his wife, promising him a better future. This, combined with the phone records, began to paint a picture of a jilted lover, determined to remove a perceived obstacle. As the evidence mounted, the investigators grew more confident that Carolyn played a central role in Betty Jeanne's murder, though they still needed a direct link tying her to the crime scene. Just as they were reaching a standstill, a breakthrough emerged in the form of a taxi driver's statement. The driver recalled picking up a woman in the vicinity of Carolyn's apartment on the night of the murder. She was wearing dark clothing and requested a drop-off near the Solomons' neighborhood. He also remembered that she was agitated, constantly checking her watch and hurrying him along. When shown Carolyn's photograph, he could not be 100% certain, but he said she resembled his passenger. Though circumstantial, this testimony bolstered the detective's theory, namely, that she claimed herself to be Carolyn. Subsequent investigation efforts honed in on Carolyn Warmus. Detectives searched her residence, where they found receipts for gloves, a suspicious phone card, and cryptic notes about taking care of obstacles. Although the language was vague, investigators interpreted it as potential evidence of premeditation. Ballistics experts also identified an individual willing to testify that Carolyn had once asked for help purchasing a .25 caliber pistol. Though that gun was never recovered, the mounting circumstantial evidence formed a compelling case. The prosecution began drafting an arrest warrant, feeling confident they had enough to charge Carolyn with second-degree murder. When the final pieces lined up, detectives made their move. Carolyn was apprehended at her apartment on a brisk morning, the same year Betty Jeanne's death had shaken the community. She did not resist arrest, and maintained her innocence throughout. The pre-trial phase commenced with a swarm of media attention. Reporters scrambled for interviews, capturing glimpses of Carolyn in stylish outfits, being escorted by law enforcement. The case had all the hallmarks of sensational news: wealth, infidelity, and a dramatic murder in a quiet suburb. Paul Solomon, meanwhile, found himself fielding endless questions about his affair, his role in the tragedy, and whether he had spurred Carolyn's actions. The process of charging Carolyn involved intense scrutiny from the district attorney's office. Prosecutors formally accused her of second-degree murder, citing the phone records, ballistic clues, eyewitness testimonies, and the personal letters as evidence of motive and premeditation. Carolyn secured a defense lawyer who promptly insisted that Paul Solomon was the real culprit, or that an unknown assailant might have been involved. Rumors circulated about a possible accomplice, or even a hired gunman, but prosecutors found no evidence to support such theories. In the months leading up to trial, legal teams from both sides filed motions. Carolyn's defense asked for certain evidence to be excluded, claiming it was speculative or hearsay. One contentious point was the taxi driver's statement, which the defense argued was unreliable. They also contested the phone records, suggesting that multiple people could have used Carolyn's phone card. The judge allowed most of the evidence, ruling that jurors should be the ultimate arbiters of its weight. Public interest soared during these pre-trial proceedings, with tabloids labeling Carolyn as the fatal attraction killer, referencing the popular film about a deadly affair. Neighborhood gossip also spiked. Many in the community sided with the prosecution, believing that Carolyn's obsessive behavior provided a clear motive for murder. Others questioned Paul's reliability, suggesting that he manipulated Carolyn or that he might have had a direct role in the crime. Through it all, the Solomon family grieved the loss of Betty Jeanne, quietly attending court dates and offering limited statements to the media. When the trial opened, the prosecution presented a meticulous reconstruction of the events leading to Betty Jeanne's murder. They paraded out the ballistic experts who testified about the shell casings and bullet trajectory, tying them to a .25 caliber pistol. The prosecution also showcased phone company representatives who explained how call records placed Carolyn near a payphone used to contact Paul's home that night. In a dramatic flourish, they introduced witnesses who testified about Carolyn's obsession with Paul, citing her increasingly desperate behavior when he wavered on leaving Betty Jeanne. Prosecutors painted Carolyn as a cunning manipulator, driven by jealousy and greed. They argued that she coveted Betty Jeanne's life and believed that by removing her, Paul would be free to marry Carolyn. The star witness came in the form of a friend who claimed Carolyn confided in her about wanting Betty Jeanne out of the picture. This, coupled with receipts for the gloves and the suspicious references to a firearm purchase, delivered a damaging blow to Carolyn's defense. When it was time for the defense to make its case, their strategy hinged on casting doubt on the prosecution's timeline. They suggested that Paul Solomon had motive and opportunity, as he could have staged the scene to frame Carolyn. The defense highlighted inconsistencies in Paul's own statements about his whereabouts. They also pointed out that no murder weapon was ever recovered, directly linking Carolyn to the crime. They questioned the reliability of witness testimonies, especially the taxi driver, who was never entirely certain of his identification. Carolyn took the stand, tearfully protesting her innocence. She admitted to the affair, but insisted she harbored no ill will toward Betty Jeanne. In a surprising twist, the first trial ended in a hung jury, reflecting the complexities of the case and the gaps in definitive proof. However, prosecutors were determined. A second trial commenced not long after, with additional evidence introduced, including new phone record analyses and a crucial piece of ballistic data from an expert witness who had refined his earlier testimony. This time, the jury found Carolyn Warmus guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict echoed through the courtroom, setting off a wave of media coverage that labeled the outcome as a triumph of justice. Note: the immediate effects of the case were palpable throughout Westchester County. Neighbors, who once felt safe in their quiet community, questioned how such a crime could happen next door. Parents at the local school faced an emotional shock, realizing that a teacher they trusted stood convicted of murdering another teacher's wife. Enrollment in that elementary school temporarily dipped as families expressed concern about the environment, though administrators assured them that the tragedy was an isolated incident. Betty Jeanne's family experienced a maelstrom of grief and anger. They struggled to cope with the public scrutiny as reporters delved into every aspect of her life and marriage. At the funeral, Paul appeared sorrowful, yet many pointed to his affair as a betrayal that set the deadly events in motion. While no criminal charges were brought against him, he faced a harsh wave of moral condemnation. His professional reputation suffered, leading him to change jobs. Some argued that he had escaped justice, while others saw him as simply another victim of Carolyn's manipulation. In the longer term, the case spurred conversations about workplace relationships and the potential for blurred boundaries to escalate into violence. Teachers in the district attended workshops on professional conduct and psychological well-being. While such training did not explicitly reference the Carolyn Warmus case, the implication was clear. Staff members should be vigilant about the red flags of obsessive or manipulative behavior. In some ways, the tragedy served as a catalyst for stricter policies against romantic entanglements in the workplace, with administrators taking a more proactive role in monitoring staff interactions. The broader legal community took note of how the prosecution leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence, phone records, suspicious receipts, and witness statements, rather than direct physical proof. Although no weapon was recovered, the conviction demonstrated the potent impact of building a coherent narrative from smaller pieces of evidence. Some legal analysts praised the case as an example of thorough detective work, while others questioned whether the second trial was influenced by media hype surrounding Carolyn's alleged fatal obsession. Historically, the Carolyn Warmus case is often referenced alongside other high-profile lovers' triangle murders that captured national attention. Newspapers and television networks offered sensational headlines, painting Carolyn as a femme fatale. This coverage, in turn, shaped public perception and arguably influenced the way such crimes were prosecuted. Over time, the story became part of the cultural lexicon, cited as a cautionary tale about allowing infatuation to spiral out of control. Even decades later, the case resonates in true crime circles, with documentaries re-examining the events and speculating about unasked questions. Some wonder if more people were complicit, if there was a friend or confidant who knew more than they revealed to investigators. Others believe that Paul's moral culpability was never fully addressed. Nonetheless, the legal outcome stands. Carolyn Warmus was convicted and served a lengthy prison sentence, and if the research helped with that, of course, sealed the deal forever on the jurisprudence. She continued to maintain her innocence, appealing multiple times and even gaining brief media attention for her claims of newly discovered evidence. Yet none of her efforts managed to overturn her conviction. In retrospect, the tragedy of Jeanne Solomon's death and the subsequent conviction of Carolyn Warmus underscored a vital lesson: beneath the surface of suburban calm, dangerous passions can lurk. The suburban community where this unfolded eventually regained a sense of normalcy, but it took years for residents to feel at ease. Some claimed they would never again dismiss strange noises in the night or chalk up a neighbor's odd behavior to mere coincidence. Jeanne's name lives on through small memorials, such as scholarships set up in her honor, reminding everyone of the life lost in a crime driven by envy and obsession. Looking back, the investigators who worked the case often cite it as a study in persistence. Without the meticulous assembly of circumstantial evidence, justice for Jeanne might have slipped away. Though the case didn't result in sweeping national policy changes, it left a mark on community policing and investigative protocols. Detectives became more attuned to the emotional undercurrents that can erupt into violence, and local advocacy groups for crime victims emphasized the importance of recognizing warning signs of obsessive behavior. In a broader sense, it served as yet another reminder of how a single act of violence can cast a long shadow over families, communities, and even legal frameworks. The Carolyn Warmus case remains a noteworthy chapter in New York's criminal history, one that speaks to the complexity of interpersonal relationships, the power of circumstantial evidence, and the tragic consequences of unchecked jealousy. For all who followed the case, the memory of Jeanne Solomon endures as a cautionary message. Behind the veneer of civility, dark impulses can foment, and sometimes it takes a painstaking investigation, piecing together phone logs, ballistic records, and eyewitness accounts to uncover the truth that no one wants to believe is possible. This case unfolded under immense media scrutiny, painting a picture of suburban betrayal and a deadly desire that ended in heartbreak. Carolyn Warmus's conviction has been upheld despite her ongoing claims of innocence, and she was eventually paroled after serving nearly 27 years. Yet no sentence, however long, can restore Jeanne's life or erase the sorrow her family endures. The final resolution, while providing a form of justice, could never fully mend the wounds left behind. The timeline reveals how quickly a veneer of normalcy can shatter. From Jeanne's daily routine of teaching and community work, to a fateful night in January 1989, to a drawn-out trial process that ended in a guilty verdict. The critical evidence hinged on phone records, ballistic analysis, and eyewitness testimony that placed Carolyn Warmus at the center of a lethal obsession. One of the key turning points was the introduction of phone company data that traced her movements and communications, as well as the receipt evidence of her attempts to acquire a .25 caliber handgun. The final resolution saw Carolyn Warmus sentenced for second-degree murder, with the legal system concluding that her jealousy and fixation on Paul Solomon drove her to commit a calculated killing. The investigation required detectives to balance public pressure and media sensationalism with thorough, methodical police work. Forensic breakthroughs involving ballistics and phone tracking played a crucial role, as did the witness testimony of a taxi driver who provided a partial identification. After 2 trials, a conviction was secured, and Carolyn began serving a prison sentence that would span over 2 decades. While some continued to debate nuances of the case, the broad consensus is that justice was served, and the heartbreak of Jeanne's family was at least partially acknowledged through the legal process. Legal precedents from this trial include the demonstration of how strong circumstantial evidence can form the backbone of a homicide conviction. The case also helped illustrate the impact of media exposure on high-profile crimes, shaping jury selection and fueling public discourse about romantic obsession leading to violence. On a social level, the tragedy sparked conversations around workplace affairs and prompted subtle shifts in workplace conduct policies, particularly in educational settings. Over time, the Carolyn Warmus case has become a cautionary benchmark, reminding communities and law enforcement alike that vigilance is necessary, even in suburban neighborhoods, and that hidden passions can erupt in the most unexpected places. There are lessons to be gleaned from this tragedy that transcend one individual or one crime. On a societal level, it underscores the importance of recognizing and addressing warning signs of obsessive or manipulative behavior before they escalate. On a policy level, it reinforces the utility of technology, such as phone records and forensic databases, in modern detective work. For families and friends who saw the devastation wrought by jealousy and infidelity, it remains a lasting reminder of how fragile life can be, and how relationships can turn deadly when dominated by lies and betrayal. Over decades, Jeanne Solomon's memory has inspired local scholarships and community outreach, demonstrating that some measure of good can arise even from such darkness. The Carolyn Warmus case in all its complexity underscores the vulnerable intersection of human emotions, modern forensic capabilities, and the legal system's capacity to untangle complicated narratives. In a very real way, it has become part of Westchester County's collective memory, cautioning that even in the most idyllic settings, tragedy can unfold if we fail to heed the warning signs and address the darker sides of human passion. The Carolyn Warmus saga is a reminder that, while justice was served through a combination of investigative tenacity and legal resolve, no verdict can ever fully undo the trauma of loss. Yet it does offer a form of closure, the knowledge that a life taken was not forgotten and that society collectively acted to hold someone accountable. It is precisely this intersection of accountability and mourning that frames the final lesson of this case. We must be vigilant, we must listen closely to the undercurrents of our communities, and we must remain resolute in seeking truth in the face of tragedy. Though the years have distanced us from that fateful winter night in 1989, the details of Jeanne Solomon's murder still cast a long shadow. Her story resonates because it reveals how swiftly ordinary life can tilt into chaos, and how carefully one must parse the truth from the tangles of human emotion. It's a case study in obsession that escalated beyond reason, reminding us that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from random acts of violence, but from those we allow into our trust. And since this book is called The Temple, I wondered whether the title suited the graphic novel or the book's entire format. No single policy or law can fully prevent a crime born out of jealousy and fixation. However, awareness is a powerful tool. Keep lines of communication open within your community, and pay attention to uncharacteristic behavior among friends and colleagues. Sometimes a subtle shift in demeanor can signal deeper troubles. In the Carolyn Warmus case, small warning signs dotted the landscape before the murder: a suspicious purchase, repeated phone calls, unsettling letters. Had these been noticed and addressed earlier, might tragedy have been averted? We cannot be sure, but communal vigilance and a willingness to intervene can be the difference between life and death. For those reading this account, consider how easily suburban facades can mask turbulent undercurrents. If something seems wrong, if a neighbor expresses fear, if a coworker exhibits obsessive tendencies, reach out to the proper channels. Talk to family members or mental health professionals if needed. Share your concerns instead of dismissing them. No one should have to live in fear or face tragedy alone. And for those intrigued by the complexities of this case, continue exploring the public records, trial transcripts, and news articles that detail it. Each perspective yields new insights into how crimes of passion can unfold, and why it's so important for communities to remain engaged and observant. What do you think about the role of media in shaping high-profile cases? Did the intense coverage help or hinder the pursuit of truth? Were there missed opportunities early on to intervene before jealousy transformed into violence? Share your thoughts or experiences with similar cases, and let's delve deeper into understanding how a spiral of obsession can potentially be halted. Exercise number 5, intervene. By fostering open dialogue, perhaps we can collectively learn how to support intervention efforts and encourage a culture that takes the subtle signs of looming danger seriously. A cheer. This concludes the story of Jeanne Solomon's tragic murder and the subsequent conviction of Carolyn Warmus for second-degree murder. It reminds us that justice can eventually prevail through patient, thorough investigation. But it also highlights how loss remains an unfillable void. The false sense of security we often associate with suburban life stands shattered by the revelation that passion, when twisted by obsession and jealousy, can lead to immeasurable harm. May the lessons from this case serve as a cautionary tale, urging us to remain vigilant, empathetic, and committed to preventing such tragedies wherever possible.